When you see people who are supposed to be elected officials representing the United States of America and their constituents actually spending more time talking about the people of Ukraine, wearing the pins, the Ukraine flag in the halls of Congress, it's kind of put a really, really scary spotlight on the people that we've elected and how many of them actually don't have Americans' best interests at heart.
It's been just over 70 days since President Trump took office, and everybody notices. Everybody notices who's in the White House. It's no longer sleepy Joe Biden. There are changes coming fast and furious on the policy front, both domestically and internationally. So much is happening. It's actually hard sometimes to keep up, but we are trying our best. And really, it's an exciting time for those of us who voted for President Trump because something is happening. What the man said he was going to do during his campaign, he is doing. In the first campaign, if you remember, and even in the second campaign, it was a little bit more general what he was campaigning on. This campaign was very specific. There were things that President Trump wanted to implement, and he's doing those things, and he's doing that quickly. So just first, quickly on the war in Israel. The war in Israel is back, and we spoke about this last week. Things look very different this time. It seems like Israel is attacking full force. We've seen a full evacuation, at least we're in the midst of it as this is being recorded, evacuation of Rafah. We're seeing Israel sticking to what they said last time, and they said it again this time now, which is Hamas, we're not going to call a ceasefire to negotiate. You're going to have to negotiate under fire. And that's what's happening today. We're seeing proposals go back and forth on the ceasefire while rockets are flying in Gaza. That's something, a policy that I think so many of us were hoping that Israel would take. There's no reason to stop the fighting just to have a negotiation. There's no minute to stop the fighting because there's still 59 hostages sitting in Gaza, 24 of them apparently still alive, which is incredible, just an incredible thing that we still have 24 hostages still alive in the tunnels, including the American Eden Alexander. There's another 4 American bodies who were killed by Hamas still being held as well. They're just sick holding these bodies of people that they murdered as negotiating chips while their families are sitting suffering and they don't even get a proper burial. But things are different this time. Everybody feels it, which is the theme. Yes, President Biden approved arms sales to Israel, but he was delaying so many of the arms being shipped over to Israel, wouldn't stop criticizing Israel, asked Israel not to go into Rafah. Now we're seeing the exact opposite. We've seen Israel rearmed to the teeth. The U.S. has really just delivered sales that were previously approved but were being held back to Israel. So Israel has the armament it needs. It has the support it needs from the United States, at least the political support. And militarily, we have the United States also fighting back against the Houthis, one of the fronts that Israel is fighting from Yemen, because they're not only attacking Israel, but they're attacking, like we went through last week, the shipping trade lines that's so critical for the United States and for the rest of the free world. And this is the only way we're going to end the war is through strength. Now, what's interesting is this week on 60 Minutes, 2 people who were held hostage, 2 men that were held hostage by Hamas. I urge everyone to go out and watch that, despite the fact that it was slightly politicized about Netanyahu and whatever else. But it's still critical to watch it, to hear their words, to understand the barbarity, as if we didn't know, but the barbarity of Hamas. We can't forget who we are dealing with, who Israel's dealing with, who the United States is dealing with, who the West is dealing with. Sometimes it's hard to remember that because of so many people that are standing with them. And we kind of have this cognitive dissonance. Like there's no way people that walk the streets in New York or in Washington, D.C. or in California or even in some places in South Florida would stand with terror organizations. But they do. And it's not just an organization. They're just barbaric humans. And to hear their stories is critical. But also to hear them say that President Trump is the only reason that they're out. They're a little slight on the prime minister. But just think about that. Someone who's of the left wing politically, because most of the hostages come from the southern Israel, the Gaza envelope. Most of the people there are politically left. I know that's irrelevant, but just to think about that those people recognize publicly that they wouldn't be out of the tunnels of Hamas if it were not for President Trump. And next we have this Liberation Day. The tariffs are going to be put into place. We'll see if they're put into place or if they're delayed. There's a lot of negotiations back and forth, which is kind of the point. But the reciprocal tariffs that President Trump and his team are putting into place are part of a strategy that President Trump has been trying to implement to bring American manufacturing jobs back home. When companies are making economic calculations as to where to open their factories, their facilities, it needs to make sense financially for them to be here. There needs to be a disincentive to be abroad and an incentive to be here domestic. That's the point. We're seeing people, working class people all over the country, supporting these actions and these tariffs. We've seen economists and professors and people of a different class complaining about it, saying that the effects that are going to have are horrendous on our economy. The truth is, only time will tell, and really, the way the market responds is going to be play a big role in it. But what's important to note that I wanted to highlight here is there's a reason why the Republican Party has become the party of the working class, because these policies are targeted at protecting the working class and growing the working class. And the working class doesn't have a race, it doesn't have a gender, it's just the working class. And they need jobs just like all of us. And these are the kind of jobs that so many of them have lost over the years to this global free trade regime that we've had, for all the right intentions from my perspective. But we need to bring those jobs back home. And that's what President Trump is trying to do. The last story that's important of highlighting this week is the slim Republican majority in the House. This 5-seat majority has been really iffy in the last 2 months, 2.5 months. We saw it in the continuing resolution debate and many other issues as they've come up, and it's only going to get more complicated as the issues become more complicated. Lots of us ask questions as to how the president was selecting members of Congress to bring them in to his administration. Of course, they were all in red districts, was the answer, but there's already been a little bit of fear on that. There's elections this week, Randy Fine and Jimmy Patronis. Those results will be out when this podcast comes out, but I am confident enough to say I'm sure Randy Fine and Jimmy Patronis will have won their seats here in Florida. Who knows what the numbers will be if they'll win the same spread as President Trump won by. I don't think it's that relevant because it's a special election. Not everybody comes out for those elections. And there's also only one candidate like Donald Trump. So the numbers won't be exactly the same, but they'll be in office. But importantly, Trump withdrew Elise Stefanik's nomination for the United Nations to get her back, to make sure that seat doesn't go blue. The GOP seems like they can't afford to lose a single seat with this majority that's just razor thin. I think the lesson there that's important is that we can't rest on our laurels. And the Republican Party needs to learn from the president. The president got into office and started running with this agenda. You hear Marco Rubio, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, talking about how quick he's moving. He says, yeah, my boss likes to work hard, so here we are. Right? You got to get things done. It's not just about campaigns. It's about getting things done. Probably as a party have 2 to 3 years to really get things done before it goes straight into election mode for the next election. We can't just kind of get cocky that we had such a big red wave in this last election. It's time to get to work. Our guest today is someone who has served as the spokesperson for the RNC. She started volunteering with Donald Trump before he became president in the first campaign. He was a real estate developer, exciting guy in New York City. This is where this young woman grew up. She went to volunteer there with her brother. And like they say, the rest is history. He's built a great relationship with the president and her family. Elizabeth Pipko, of course, I'm speaking about. Elizabeth was also a model, an author, degrees from Harvard and Penn, a violinist. It comes from a family from the USSR, Soviet Union, who came over in the 70s and early 80s. Her story is really an incredible story. She's been a fighter not just for the Republican Party, for the president, but also for the Jewish people. She fights against anti-Semitism, is a proud patriot, but also a proud Zionist. So to have her here in the studio today is really exciting to talk about her journey, messaging in the Republican Party, anti-Semitism, Russia, lots of great topics. I'm sure you all enjoy it. This is Standpoint, and I'm Gabe Groisman. And before we get started, I wanted to thank our sponsor, Kufi, Christians United for Israel. As you know, the landscape in the Middle East is reshaping before our eyes. Blink and you'll miss something. Whatever happens there will impact all of us. At the center of it all, of course, is the state of Israel. Our U.S. government's policies towards the Middle East have never been more important, and the time period never more filled with potential and fraught with peril. Israel's enemies are America's enemies, and the terror organizations determined to annihilate Israel have the same plans for the U.S. I have news for them. They're going to fail. But Christians United for Israel is America's largest pro-Israel organization. They're leading the charge to help keep America on the right side of God and of history. This summer, Join me as I join thousands of pro-Israel Americans at the 20th Annual CUFI Washington Summit, June 29th through July 1st. While you're there, you'll learn from leading policy experts and Middle East experts, and you'll get to make your voices heard on Capitol Hill. Do not be a bystander. Register for the 20th Annual CUFI Washington Summit today at cufi.org with promo code Standpoint25. Yes, we got our own promo code, Standpoint25. Be a part of a movement that's at the forefront of history. I've been at this conference. I was there last year. Fantastic conference. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Elizabeth Pipko, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, I've been trying to get you on the podcast for months. Let's just throw this out there. You were too busy before. I'm glad that your schedule opened up, but it's funny. I'm just joking. But what's nice is, by sheer coincidence, we got to spend some time this weekend with our family, with your husband, with my wife, with the kids. It was really, really so nice to spend some time with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like Hashem wanted us to be friends, and that's why we waited a little bit.
That's right. We had to make sure it wasn't just we ran into each other at some events or not. So listen, as I was preparing for this, it was interesting. I kept thinking about my daughters. Like our listeners know, I have 5 daughters. My oldest is 18, and they share lots of similarities with you. At least the older ones do for now. Into politics. You're a big patriot. You're a Zionist. You're a strong woman. One thing they don't do yet, or they haven't done yet, is what you've done, which is work for the most powerful person in the world, Donald J. Trump. I think since 2016. And just doing some quick math, I'm not a math guy. I think you were 21, 22 when you started working. 21
yeah, so
when you started.
So my entire adult life was given to Donald Trump.
Yeah, so far you've got some time. But tell me a little bit how you got into this. You know, you're 21 years old, living in New York City. How did you end up working for the presidential campaign?
Yeah, so I grew up in New York City, so I knew who Donald Trump was just as a New Yorker. Basically, if I wasn't in Central Park because it was raining, my babysitter took us to Trump Tower to like run up and down because they had a cool fountain and, you know, a bunch of escalators. So that's what I knew of Donald Trump, the guy with the TV shows, the guy with Trump Tower, the guy whose name was on every building. And then I was also a figure skater. So I knew about Donald Trump because his name was on Wallman Rink in Central Park where I started skating. So that's who Donald Trump was to me. And then in 2015, I was in a really, really bad spot in my life. I thought I was going to go to the Olympics. I trained as an athlete for most of my life. I was homeschooled, gave up really everything, broke nearly every bone in my body, and then had an injury that I just could not recover from. Doctors said I would probably not run or walk normally or wear heels ever again. They were very wrong, but I knew that the Olympics were never going to happen. And
that was figure skating, right?
That was figure skating, yes. And I fell into a really, really deep depression. And in 2015, I think it was right before Donald Trump actually announced that he was running, my little brother told me that if I want to get my life together, or get my act together, as he put it, I should start listening to Donald Trump. I should buy some of his books, listen to his speeches, and that I would grow from there. And I kind of ignored him for a few months, then got into it. And right away, I knew what he saw in him and why he thought that was important for me. I mean, at that time, Donald Trump had announced that he was running for president. He was polling at 1 or 2%. And yet every single day, despite what people were saying about him, he got up and said, I will be the next president of the United States. And I think that confidence is what I desperately needed and what my brother knew would inspire me. So I became a very, very quick Trump supporter. I started, taking my life a little more seriously, starting to go to the gym for the first time in a while, putting makeup on for the first time in a long time, just feeling better about myself. And then the summer of 2016, my brother asked me to go volunteer for him for the president's campaign. Volunteering usually is phone banking, especially if you're in New York City and you're not knocking on doors. So we went to phone bank in Trump Tower. It was very exciting, but the athlete in me came out very, very quickly, and I said, I want more. I wrote a letter to the data director of the campaign saying, this is what's wrong with your volunteer operation. I asked an intern to bring it up and leave it on his desk. They called me and hired me the next day. I said I would not join without my brother. They gave him a job a week later, and the rest it's history.
So tell me a little bit more what you did for the campaign. Now, this is the first campaign. We'll get into the next one. I'd love to know about the journey.
Yeah, so I basically took over the volunteer operation like I had pitched in that letter. So I ran every volunteer office around the country. So that phone banking program was under me. I talked to every state director around the country. I kind of worked with the political team to get data over to them and did what I promised to do, fix that volunteer operation. And I think it was the most special job anyone could have because there are difficult days on every single campaign, but unless you meet the people that you're kind of in it for, it's very easy to kind of go backwards and have moments where it's hard for you. I was walking into Trump Tower every day getting spit on by protesters outside. Like, it was a very, very difficult job. I was 21 on a presidential campaign. I was thrilled to be there, but the entire world wanted me to know I was a bad person for being there. So it's hard. And then you go downstairs to the volunteer center and you meet people that are giving everything up just to sit there and make phone calls because they believe in Donald Trump. So I got to deliver, Purple Hearts and gold stars up to the president that they wanted him to have. There was a homeless woman, I've told this story before, who gave me $20 in a note that said, "This is all I have, but I saved it for President Trump. Go make America great again." I mean, I met some of the most incredible people that this country has, and they gave me the strength to keep going, but also reminded me every day why I was doing this and how much support Donald Trump actually had. That's why I knew he was going to win, because it didn't matter what the TVs were saying. Thousands of people wrote to me every single day to relay some kind of message to him about how he had changed their lives and how they had hope again for this country because of him. So it was probably the most special job I could ever have. And even now, years later, getting some bigger opportunities in politics, I've always tried to have some tiny, tiny role in the volunteer operation because it's so, so magical.
Yeah, it's incredible when you get involved in those phone banks and see the people that there's almost more energy there than in the front row seats. And actually, if you think about that analogy as you're speaking, it's the same as going to a football game. Sometimes there's more energy in the nosebleeds than a courtside or at the 50-yard line. I think there's a little bit of that. Tell me a little bit about the first time you met Donald Trump, because I know now you have a close relationship with the president, but how was that? What was the first time you met him, and how's that relationship?
So there's a few times that I've met him where I don't know if he realized like who I was. I just continued to meet him. I met him as a little girl because he showed up to give out medals at a figure skating competition at Walnut Rink. I met him when I was probably 19 or 20 when he had just launched his campaign. He signed my figure skate for me and I got to tell him my story. I was just like at a book signing he was doing. And then on the campaign, I actually got to speak to him the day that the Access Hollywood tape came out. He was on our floor, which was actually the floor that The Apprentice was shot on. I think I was the only woman on that floor, and he just walked over to me and asked me my thoughts. So that was the first real conversation I had with him. And then it really wasn't till this last campaign, 2024, that I actually like grew to have a relationship with him in some way. I'd been very close with members of his family and his team, but 2024 was when I actually got to spend a good amount of time with the president.
Well, seems to be a big disparity between what people think of Donald Trump on a personal level that know him personally versus people that don't know him personally. Tell me a little bit, first of all, what do you attribute that to? Because I hear you saying yes, Gary. You hear it all the time. Anyone who meets him says and has spent time with him in any meaningful way will say great things about him. He's so warm. He's so friendly. He cares about his family. He cares about what you think. He's funny. All these things that are kind of the exact opposite of the way he's portrayed in the media. By the way, even on the right media, right or left, he's portrayed so differently than those people who know him. What do you attribute that delta to?
I mean, I think a good chunk of it is the obvious, trying to disparage his characters. People don't vote for him. But a lot of it is also just not understanding him. I think I talk about this with my husband all the time. I've been in politics for 8 years now, and I've met some really, really nasty people, like just truly bad characters. And I've also met the Trump family, who I would actually categorize as some of the best people I've ever met. And I think even for me, it's surprising to realize that it's the billionaires literally at the top of this industry, the top of the world right now, that have treated me nicer than most people I've met in this world. So I think it's actually also confusing for people, and they assume it might have some kind of ulterior motive. I mean, my husband and I met on the campaign in 2016, and when the family found out that we were engaged, they gave us Mar-a-Lago as a gift to get married in, and koshered the kitchen and made it, an Orthodox Jewish wedding for us too. But I mean, what family would do that?
Wait, tell me about this. So if people don't know, if you eat kosher, Jewish, and you eat kosher, which are the Jewish laws of the way we eat our food, what we eat, what we don't eat. If you go to a kitchen that's not kosher, it's a whole process. It's not even easy to do.
No, it's
to boil the pots. You got to use fire. There's a whole thing of what to do. They did that at Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, just as a gift, because they knew that we were Jewish and having a religious wedding. My rabbi felt welcomed there. They went through every step possible. I had the most beautiful wedding in the world because of, the president and his family, who just thought that my husband and I should have that. They called us ahead of time to ask us which kosher wine we wanted, because they were proud of the kosher wines that they carried, but didn't know if that's what we liked. We
have to check what kind of wines they carry.
But yeah, they're just decent people. I've spent so much time with the president, and even the feedback that he gives in a work environment, like randomly after, I think his debate, for example, with Kamala Harris, I went on TV that night, and he made sure to text me that night to let me know he thought I did really well, and he appreciated it. There's just random moments where he makes you feel like a real person. And I've met a lot of people much wealthier, much more successful than me that not only don't make you feel that way, but don't feel the need to. And he and his family have always made sure that everyone on their side, anyone working for them, feels appreciated and knows for a fact that there's a reason why they're there. And I've never experienced that, not just in politics, but on the outside, ever with anybody. So they shouldn't just get credit for being, better than what the media portrays them to be. They're better than most people. And that's why I feel the need to always defend them, because it's shocking to me genuinely to read about them versus, to text Lara Trump like I do very regularly and just have a conversation with her. And I almost forget that this is the same person everyone's talking about, because it's just impossible to believe anything in the media anymore, because the way they're portrayed could not be further from the truth.
You served as a spokesperson for the RNC during the campaign,
Yeah.
correct? And so what was the main goal there of being the spokesperson? Was it really serving to translate what the candidate, President Trump, was saying to the media, or just respond to the fire that was coming in? I mean, tell me a little bit about how you deal with that as a spokesperson. It's got to be one of the hardest jobs as a spokesperson. Although KJP, spokesperson for Biden, who was probably one of the worst spokespersons in our history, but to her credit, it might have been the more difficult
Probably more
job.
difficult. She was the president and the spokesperson.
Right.
Yeah, no, for me, it was easier because, Donald Trump is his own spokesperson. First of all, he's very good at it. And I've always said that he won back in 2016, and he's as popular as he is now because he's so good at being a spokesperson. People mock him all the time for the way he speaks to this day, but they don't realize they're actually mocking the American people because they actually resonate with him so well. He's a great spokesperson for himself and also for what he believes in. A lot of politicians, as well as I do, they claim to believe in something because their consultants told them that's where they would get their votes. Donald Trump is the opposite. He doesn't care what any polling shows. He tells the people what he thinks is best. And because he's so genuine in the way he talks about it, people eventually realize that what he's pitching them is actually what is best for them and how they should vote. He does it the reverse of every politician, which doesn't get enough credit for. He's actually a wonderful spokesperson. But for me, it was the spokesperson for the Republican Party at a time when we represented the movement that was behind Donald Trump. And I think one of the most important elections in American history. I've always said, if he wasn't the candidate, I wouldn't have taken the job. And if he wasn't the candidate, I don't think they would have wanted me for the job. It was a very, very good fit. I never wanted to be the face of any political party. I'm actually against that. But when the political party represents the movement that is behind Donald Trump, it was a huge honor.
Yeah. So when I read about your story, first of all, it resonates a lot, as my family comes from Russia as well, although we left during the pogroms in the late 1800s to Argentina and then came here. Your family came in the 70s, and I think 1980, I think one of your parents came, right? And I remember that because that's the year I was born, which means I'm much older than you. But, I heard you talk about your family's story, how they came here with $70 or $90, which you said, each in their pockets, and just have two kids who are successful. It's two of you, right?
Yes.
So two kids who are successful, and you're in this public role, sitting with the President of the United States, getting married at the Winter White House, Mar-a-Lago. First, I just want to know how your parents reacting to your political involvement, to your success, to your the public nature of what you're doing.
No one's ever asked me that. They've asked if people were proud, if my parents are proud of me. They've never asked how they deal with, how public it all is.
I also know, just to put a fine point on it, sorry to interject, I also know of people and families, especially Jewish families, who come from the USSR. And they come here and they're afraid to talk about politics. They'll whisper in their own living room about politics in case someone's listening, because that's how they were conditioned, right?
Yeah, I think it's weird because that's how I was raised. Not just because they wanted to whisper. I think it was the opposite. They actually didn't want to whisper because that's how they grew up and that's why they came here, to not have to do it anymore. But I think because of what they went through, they didn't see themselves as wanting to be political ever. They were just excited to get to vote, to get to publicly advocate for what they want and vote for whatever they want and alternate between parties and candidates and whatever they want, because that's the point of being American. I don't know how well they deal with how public this is. I know my mom is the most chill, amazing, cool person in the world, and she doesn't care about anything and is just happy I'm happy. I know for a fact my dad reads comments on videos and probably gets angry and sits there stirring but doesn't want to call me and tell me. I think they're excited because, and I don't want to speak for them, but I'll speak for my grandparents, some of whom are no longer here. This is why they escaped, right? This is why they gave up everything, so that their future generations could not just be proud Americans, but be proud Jews and be vocal and be all the things that they couldn't be. They gave up literally everything, came with $90 in their pockets, risked it all, and it worked out, right? Because that's the whole point of America, and that's what they dreamed of back in the Soviet Union. So I think I do what I do for them. I want their sacrifice to make sense and to be worth it. And I think now I can say I think that it has been. I remember standing with President Trump at the OHEL, which I got to go to with him on the anniversary of October 7th. I mean, for the daughter of, two Jewish refugees who came here not knowing if they'd ever have, $10 in their pockets, to take the president of the United States to, a significant spot, not only because I'm American with the president, but a significant spot as a Jew. I mean, that is the dream of every single immigrant. So for me in that moment is when I was like, okay, maybe my grandpa finally feels like it all worked out. So I'm hopeful, but I'm not going to stop. I'm going to keep going. But
So I want to ask you another question
Yeah.
about your family, but you talked about the Ohel. I wanted to ask you, for those listening who don't know what
Yes.
Ohel means, it's the gravesite of the Lubavitcher Rebbe,
Yeah.
who's the leader of probably the largest Jewish outreach movement in the last couple hundred years by far. People have seen Chabad houses, Chabad. So people who don't know call them Chabad houses. But
Chabad, I've heard Chabad.
Chabad, and they're Jewish outreach centers for Jews. They're not trying. There's no proselytizing. We're trying to bring people in Judaism. We don't do that. But it's more trying to bring in Jews who are not connected, and they're in every city in the world, it seems like. And it's this man, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who sent them all over the world. It was his idea. We were talking about it this weekend a little bit, and it's like he created an app store and let everybody be independent under this brand, and it's really worked. Tell me about that visit with President Trump. This was before the election, just before the election, for him to take the time to go to one of the most significant Jewish sites in the country. It didn't seem like a PR stunt at all. It was like this serious sort of place where you go pray here in the United States. Yeah. And what was it like to be there for him? How did you see him react to being there?
No, it was incredibly special. I spent most of my time crying, I'll be honest, because it hits you when you're there. I'd been to the OHEL to pray, but I never imagined going with the president of the United States. By the way, the first president to ever visit the OHEL. It was impactful, and he knew that. He knew that it was going to look like more than just, campaigning, like you said, because it was sending a message that he was going to stand with the Jewish community, especially at a time when we are struggling so much. This was the anniversary of, the worst atrocity for Jewish people since the Holocaust. And I remember waking up wondering what Joe Biden or Kamala Harris would do that day, not because they were the competition for my boss, but because they're the current leaders. And I was curious. I think Kamala Harris planted a tree. I don't think Joe Biden did anything. So to know that when the Jewish community was hurting like this, and when our strongest ally, Israel, is hurting like this, that's what they came up with. That's when I knew how important this was, because it wasn't about his campaign. It was about sending a message that America would always stand with Israel, stand with the Jewish people, and stand against hate always. For a man like Donald Trump to put on the kippah that I brought him that day, to go there and pray with us, to stand there with the family of Idan Alexander, who is still being held to this day, to stand there and pray for his return, for the end of the war, to, pledge his support for the Jewish people who really are hurting right now. It's so meaningful, especially compared, unfortunately, to what was going on in the White House. And it was important. And, to stand there, I was, in the women's section. So I'm across from him and I'm looking at him and I'm realizing I'm partially responsible for bringing him there. And I'm getting to literally witness history. Lara Trump is standing next to me, asking me, questions about whose hand she's allowed to shake and why we put stones, on the tombstones, for example, and all these little things that I'm getting to explain to this now the first family. It was magical. It was beautiful. And again, I hope people realize it's not just that it was political. It was special because of the people behind it. Donald Trump is a human being, and Lara Trump is a human being, and everybody there wanted to be there for the right reasons. And every night when I go to sleep now, knowing that that's the man that's in the White House who's responsible for all of us for the next 4 years, thank God.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts in response. It's so beautiful to hear you say that. First of all, I was in the White House a few weeks ago. I wear a kippah. I only started wearing one, a head covering on the top of my head about 2.5 years ago. And it had to do with all the anti-Semitism happening in the world. And I said, you know what? I have to be proud to be Jewish wherever I am. And I was in Washington. I had a meeting by Union Station, and it was very windy. And somehow I lost my kippah. It never happened, at least that I remember. It just flew off, and I didn't realize. I was in a rush. And 10, 15 minutes later, I realized I didn't have one on my head. And I'm like, how am I going to go into the White House? And disclaimer, my meeting was not with the president. Okay? It was somebody else in the White House. But how am I going to walk in there not representing who I am? Like, it becomes part of who you are. So to tie the stories together, I called the local Chabad rabbi, who's a emissary, is what they call him, of the Rebbe, who's the gravesite you were at with the president. And I told him the story. He says, come quickly to my house. And he gave me actually a kippah with the White House emblem on it, which I had. I had one of those in my house from the Hanukkah party, the first term. And I walked around the White House with it, and I felt so much pride. And so many people stopped me just in the hallway because they saw the White House emblem on it, and they were asking me questions about it. So sort of that moment where you can be proud, and that wasn't even affecting what he was doing, but just to really, I think it really has to do with the moment the Jews are living in this in this time, in this day and age. And it's not woe is me. I don't do the victim thing, right? But there are realities of what we're going through.
Yeah.
You work a lot on those issues, right? It's something that you're very vocal about. For me, it's very natural, right? A Jewish girl from New York City, conservative in politics, talking about anti-Semitism, but it's not that natural anymore these days, right? People are not out there. First of all, did you have to make a conscious decision to start being vocal on that issue, or is that something that just is part of who you are?
Yeah, like you said, it's just natural. Like to this day, people are so excited when they meet me to talk about, politics. And I know no one believes me, but I say all the time, I am who I am and I do what I do, and it's not political. Like, I don't think what's going on is political. I know that sounds weird, but I'm not trying to be political. I'm just doing what comes naturally to me. And that's why I always said I didn't want to represent a political party. For example, I'm more than proud of my work with the GOP this last term, but I'm not pledging my loyalty to some party till the end of time. It just felt natural right now. I thought Donald Trump was the obvious choice and the best person to be president right now. And I think nothing I do is political. It's just natural. And whether that's standing up for the country, for a candidate I think is best for our future, or for the Jewish people, it's just, like you said, it's just who I am. It's just natural.
Yeah, it resonates what I'm saying, because one of my biggest pet peeves is groupthink. When everybody thinks the same, everyone makes the same arguments. Like, we can land in the same place, but if you're making the same arguments, you're not even thinking for yourself. You're just repeating what people are saying. And actually, Joe Lieberman, of blessed memory, the senator, was writing an op-ed when he died, which was then published. I don't know if you ever saw it. It was a letter to Democratic leadership saying the Jews have been voting with Democrats for decades. Don't take our vote for granted. You've strayed from us. Either come back or we're going to leave. And it reminds me, actually, when I met President Trump, I met him twice in my life. And once when I met him, he saw my kippah and he said, I can't do his voice, so I won't even pretend. But he said, so why, how are you going to get the Jews to vote for me this time? It was during the election. I think he asked everyone he saw with the kippah that same question. Anyways, we had a really nice, interesting, nuanced conversation of his understanding of within the Jewish community is interesting. And we're now 2.5 months, almost 3 months into the presidency, which it feels like 10 months, but because of how much he's done. But it's also, it feels really good to see that he's doing what he said he was going to do when it comes to the Jewish community and Israel, because so many people told us that he was just doing it to get the votes.
That's all I've heard for 8 years.
That's it. And well, especially the second term, because he doesn't have to get reelected. Right. And if he was mad at David Friedman because whatever, everyone's making up all these stories, and it turns out none of it's true, and he's been doing the right things. When you think about your family, just to go back to that a second before going to another topic, how do you and your family look at the issue of communism and the Democratic Party? And I'll tell you why. In the last election, the previous election with Clinton in Miami-Dade, it was the first time that Trump got close to winning. He then won by a lot the next time. And the number one, when everyone polled, the number one term that was talked about was communism. Yep. That was it. All the Latins, my family's from Argentina, all Latin Americans here in the United States, they care about nothing more than communism. And they don't want anything to do with it because they've seen it.
Of course.
And no one has seen it as much as Russians, right? Like even what we had in Latin America or have in Latin America is just an offshoot of what your parents and your family went through. How do you and your family look at that growth of the sort of communist left-wing, extreme left-wing ideologies coming back here in the United States?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm more than comfortable talking about my parents because they're not political. Like it's natural for them. And I remember growing up, my dad actually had spent a lot of time, we're in New York City, right? My dad was very successful and I had met a lot of Democrats through him. Both my parents told me growing up, especially for my mom, she came when she was younger, but both sets of, my dad when he came by himself with his mom and my mom with her parents, she was a little girl, but she said they were told immediately, you're Jewish, so you register as Democrats, you vote Democrat. And that's kind of all that they thought of growing up. And my mom to this day will tell me she remembers when George Bush Jr. got elected. And she sat there and cried her eyes out because she was told that a Republican could not, was going to be an anti-Semite and horrible for Israel. And then she sent him a letter apologizing to him many years later. Yeah, because she thought it would matter to him. But yeah, my parents, they weren't loyal Democrats. They didn't really care much for the party. They just thought it was so obvious Democrats support Jews. That's what they were told when they got here. And I mean, it is fair to say for a good chunk of time, both sides really did stand with the Jewish people, with Israel. But the Democrat Party right now, I mean, it doesn't really exist anymore, right? The Democrat Party of JFK, long gone. This is not the same party. And it's across the board. It's anti-Semitism, it's communism, it's common sense, it's any kind of connection to the voters of this country. They seem totally removed from the daily lives of the people in this country. That's what I notice every single day. And it's almost like they don't care because for as long as I can remember, as long as they, I'm sure, can remember, they've had their own recipe for how to win an election. And only after social media kind of came to be and Donald Trump came up, their recipe kind of worked. At least, here and there it worked every other election. And now it doesn't work anymore. They have to be real people because Donald Trump set that precedent. They have to be able to have conversations and defend their policies and keep those policies when they get elected. And they can't do that. They have to kind of move forward in a way that they actually have to answer to the votes that they get. And instead, they have shied away from that. They've realized that they took almost every single minority group for granted and that people are finally realizing that and they don't know how to pick up the pieces because, again, everyone from that old school Democrat Party is gone. And the JFK, my dad once looked up to him so much. It doesn't exist. No one in this party has any relation to that man anymore. Ironically, there's a Kennedy now on the Republican side in Donald Trump's administration. So I was raised, obviously, with every single warning of socialism and communism and anti-Semitism and all these things, which is why I tell people I had the privilege of being raised by immigrants. I got a lot of life lessons that most American kids didn't get. So I can understand young people not understanding the threats of communism. I really do. I had the privilege of my parents telling all of that to me because it was their life story. And maybe if my grandpa with tears in his eyes hadn't explained communism to me, I actually wouldn't know myself. So my problem is not with the young people in this country. It's with the politicians who definitely know better, but are trying to lean into wherever they can still salvage some votes for themselves, which happens to be with the young vocal people on Twitter who believe communism is the way forward. And it's really sad to see, but I think they're destroying themselves more and more by the day. And maybe it's a good thing because they can only rebuild once they actually completely crumble.
That's very optimistic for the Democrats. I wrote an article right after the election saying it was time for them to have a reckoning. I wasn't the only one who was writing this kind of thing, and assuming they were going to because it was so obvious. But so far I've been wrong. And these last 2 weeks on all over media, and again, this is when you see them all saying the same thing. Those are talking points getting pushed out of what's the leadership of the Democratic Party, what's the next leadership going to be, and they're floating out names like Jasmine Crockett and AOC, and kind of the worst of the worst. And from a Republican perspective, go ahead and do it. But from a American perspective, that's terrible for all of us, right? How's your family looking at the war as it's expanding now or continuing now or how do you look at it, between Russia and Ukraine? Putin is an interesting figure because obviously he's a war criminal and a piece of garbage on so many different things.
Yes.
So I don't have to be eloquent. You if you're still you're not a spokesperson anymore, so maybe you don't either. But what's interesting is with the Jewish community, he actually has a decent relationship within Russia. The Jewish community in Russia seems mostly protected under Putin and they have almost a warm relationship. Again, it's not the kind of warm of going to have a cup of coffee on a Saturday afternoon. But how do you look at that?
Yeah, so I have had these conversations a bunch because obviously my family is, from that part of the world. Every person in my family, except for me, my brother, my two cousins who are my age, came from Ukraine or Estonia or Russia or, Belarus or somewhere in that part of the world. So I've had to have this debate and this argument and this conversation with a lot of people. And, I'll be honest, when the war started, I was very much on the side of Ukraine. I mean, I'm still technically on the side of Ukraine. I'm on the side of decency and democracy everywhere. But I think what's happened since the war has been really disappointing. And again, another eye-opening moment for people who are looking at the two parties and trying to understand how they've flipped so much in the last few years and how much they've changed. The fact is, when you see people who are supposed to be elected officials representing the United States of America and their constituents actually spending more time talking about the people of Ukraine, of course, that leaves a really bad taste in your mouth. And I've spent a lot of time trying to understand how that happened, how we went from just saying Putin is bad and we should be on the side of Ukraine to saying every dollar that we have goes to Ukraine, wearing the pins of the Ukraine flag in the halls of Congress, advocating for Ukrainians more than we're advocating for homeless veterans or youth in America or so many people that are actually struggling. So again, it's been very strange to witness this. And I think between the war in Gaza and the war between Russia and Ukraine, Donald Trump's, come back and fall and come back and fall and come back again. It's kind of put a really, really scary spotlight on the people that we've elected and how many of them actually don't have Americans' best interests at heart. It's very strange to actually see it all blasted in your face like this. again, without social media, I don't know how many of us would see it, but to realize that it really hits because I had a really different idea of America growing up. And I still think it's the greatest country in the world, but I don't think I realized how many corrupt people existed in really serious positions in the country. And without the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine and everything I've seen happen to Donald Trump these last few years, I would never have seen that. So it's been really difficult actually understanding it, but I think America should do the right thing always, but I think the right thing starts at home. And that's the best way to talk about the war. If we had anyone telling us what it looks like when you say a victory for Ukraine, maybe we should keep funding it, maybe we should keep being invested, but no one can actually vocalize what they mean by a victory for Ukraine. The only thing I've heard is more dollars and more interest and more talk about Ukraine. And the fact is when Americans are struggling, even when they're not, by the way, but especially when they're struggling, they deserve an explanation and they deserve answers. And no Democrat believes that Americans deserve those answers. Even some Republicans don't believe they deserve those answers. And that's what's disappointing. So I think no matter what you believe in, foreign policy-wise, you should answer to the American people when you lay out those beliefs. And people aren't doing that, and that's sad.
Yeah, I tie a line between everything that's happening in our society straight through what's happening with the war, and I'll explain what I mean. In that these days, you're either for something or against something. There's no room for nuance, right? So if you're for Ukraine, which everyone was when Russia invaded there, despite why they invaded and the provocations, it's still something it's dangerous for the Western world, and not just for Europe, even though people on the right think it's just for Europe, but really for the Western world. And there's a good reason to stop them. But it doesn't mean you can't ask questions, and you should be able to ask questions. And I know what the anti-Semites and anti-Israel people who listen to this are going to be thinking. Well, can't you ask about Israel? Sure, you can ask.
You should ask about
and I'll
Israel.
tell you what the answers are without a problem. But the problem is with Ukraine, you couldn't ask. You couldn't ask where the money's going. You couldn't ask what we're funding. And really, it's just about accountability to the American people, good times or bad times. If we're spending our dollars abroad, we should be able to explain why proudly. And I think when it comes to the Israel-Gaza war, Israel-Hezbollah war, Israel-Iran war, we can explain that very easily and tie it very quickly to why it's important to the American national security interests. We've done it on this show probably 1,000 times in the last year, and I think all our listeners know at least my position on it, and I'm sure yours isn't very different. There's only two more questions I want to ask you because I want to be respectful of your time. But the first has to do with when you still are, but when you were modeling for Wilhelmina, I think you were still with them. I don't know if you still are or not. You're not. Okay, so when you were with the agency, and I heard you say in previous interviews, if I'm wrong, just correct me, that you were at first trying kind of to hide that you were working in politics, working for the Trump campaign. This is the first campaign, right? And then you were at Harvard, and it's kind of the same thing. You were trying to keep separate your politics and tying together something else you said previously of saying you were hopeful for a time when you can actually just say your opinions, right? And not trying to hide who you are. How did people react to that when they found out that you're a MAGA girl, right? You're working for Trump.
People were not happy. I actually hid it for 2 years. So when I worked on the campaign in 2016, I wasn't as much of a public figure at all. I don't know how many people knew anything about me, but I did have a modeling career. So I hid it every single day. If I couldn't make a casting or something, I would just lie and say that I was busy with schoolwork or something else. Ironically, my bosses on the campaign tried to help me and let me out for castings and different things. But nobody knew. And after we won, I decided not to go to the White House. I didn't have a college degree. I had so much, growing up to do that I just wanted to stay a human being and kind of absorb the fact that I just helped a man become president and, get my life together. So I never really talked about it. And then because I met my husband on the campaign, he had stayed involved and he was already working on the re-election campaign. We got engaged and then we found out that the president's family was giving us Mar-a-Lago. And only after we got married at Mar-a-Lago was I contacted by a media outlet who told me they were going to run the story of my wedding. I didn't really understand why. I'd posted some photos on social media, but not many. But we did have cute Make Marriage Great Again MAGA hats. We got married at Mar-a-Lago. I don't really know what the story was, but they were going to run with some story. So at that point, I knew that it was all going to come out and I had to just, finally tell my story. So I contacted a different outlet and sat down with a reporter and actually told my story of why I hid it and, what was going to probably happen now that it was out and I was 100% right. No one talked to me. My agencies dropped me and didn't talk to me ever again. Really, I lost a lot of friends. Ironically, some people actually knew that I worked for Trump, but only once it became public did they drop me because they were okay with it, but God forbid a friend of theirs wasn't okay with it. Like I said, I was a figure skater, so I wasn't training anymore, but I was still skating regularly because I love the sport. I lost coaches who didn't want to be associated with me. Some family members still don't speak to me. it was a really, really strange, sad time just because they had known for many, many years and I had just forgotten that this was even, a negative thing. He was also president at the time, so I didn't really understand why it was such a big deal. I didn't know why an outlet wanted to do a story on my wedding to begin with. And then they did it, and I told my story, and people stopped talking to me, and it was a great lesson because now we're, 7 years later or something, and I don't really need most people in my life, and I learned the lesson the hard way, but it was very, very strange how it happened.
So you were dropped by the agency.
Yeah.
You were dropped by brands also that you were doing campaigns for?
I don't know if I was dropped, but anyone, a lot of people I had modeled for, took the photos down and pretended there was no association.
Yeah. So these days I'm not surprised by anything anymore, right. And the intolerance from the left is what jumps out at me all the time, right? Yeah. Because I have no problem sitting with anybody or even working with people who I disagree with politically. Quote, some of my best friends are leftists, but it's actually true. Come run with me during the week, and we fight about politics the whole time. The problem is they read the New York Times every morning, so it's always the same fight. I'm like, guys, it's just not really a newspaper. But you said you were hoping that things would change. Have things changed for you?
For me personally, yes, quite a bit. I used to be scared of everything. And even though now my husband, I'm sure, will still tell you that I'm an anxious mess, I don't really have fears anymore. A, because of what I went through, but B, because of what Donald Trump went through. When you watch a guy get shot in the head, when you watch a guy, look, I don't even know what it would have been, probably a life in prison in the eye. He knew if he lost the election, the Democrats were going to make sure he died in jail. When you can look that in the eye and get up every morning and still crack a joke and still believe in yourself, and you watch that man do it and then you watch him succeed, you realize that anything is possible, and you kind of eliminate the idea of having any fears whatsoever. And again, he won. You can say whatever you want about him and me, but clearly majority of the country agrees. So yeah, I feel very, very different.
So we have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you one more. I lied to you before. Both of us deal a lot with anti-Semitism in our own different ways. The anti-Semitism on the left has finally become apparent, obvious, and is the leading figure on anti-Semitism, leading driver of anti-Semitism. But looking within our own house, within the Republican Party, we know that there's this fringe that's mostly in the media, but a little bit in Congress, not in the White House, thankfully, that is isolationist, that's anti-Semitic, that's they're not anti-American like the left anti-Semites are, but it's sort of the old school traditional anti-Semitism. Have you seen that, and how do you think we should deal with it?
I've obviously seen it. We've all seen it. Like you said, it's not in the White House. The opposite actually is in this administration, which is amazing to see. You said it's just anti-Semitism. It's not anti-American. I agree that's what they want it to look like. But the fact is, I'm sure you've said on the show countless times, if you support America, you would support Israel because the relationship actually makes a lot of sense for the safety and security of our country. You don't have to be Jewish to support Israel and to understand that. So I think it's just blatant anti-Semitism, honestly, or sheer ignorance. There's a lot of ignorance, even in elected officials. People would be surprised. But I think the best way to deal with it is to call it out. Like I said, I have no fear anymore. I learned from Donald Trump that anything's possible, but I've seen him call it out. I've seen him just defiantly stand in the face of that and say, that's not my Republican Party. I think that's what we should all do. The fact is, I want this country to not learn the lesson the hard way. I don't want an October 7th in this country. So calling it out is actually a lot easier than having to, God forbid, experience that. And that's what drives me every day, and countless other people like you that have to wake up every day and do this because, like you said, it just comes naturally to you. And I think the more people to speak out, the more victories we're going to have. Because if people didn't speak out and support Donald Trump after everything he went through, he wouldn't have won in 2024. And I don't know how many people realize the impact that they had. So as long as you speak out, A, you can probably sleep and put your head down on your pillow at night. And B, you might actually have a little piece in changing the world.
Elizabeth Pipko, thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for coming into the studio. And we all that are here appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And everyone, we'll see you next time. Make sure to like, subscribe, follow, and do all the great things you do to support podcasts. Thanks so much.